It's my body. You don't get to demand anything from me. My name is Derek Langston. I'm 33, been teaching 3rd grade at Westfield Elementary in Kansas City, Missouri for 8 years. When my wife Madison said those words, we'd been married exactly 5 weeks and 2 days. Not once in that time had she let me touch her. Not a kiss that lasted more than a second. Not holding hands while we watched television. Nothing. I sat there on our couch, the same brown leather one I'd bought 3 years ago when I thought I'd be alone forever, and tried to understand what she meant. We dated for 14 months. We talked about everything. We'd been intimate before the wedding. Hell, we'd lived together for 6 months before we got married. But the moment we said I do at St. Catherine's Chapel, something changed. Madison, I'm not demanding anything. I'm asking why you won't even kiss me goodnight. She turned back to her phone, scrolling through something I couldn't see. I told you my body, my choice. That phrase had been her answer to everything lately when I asked if we could share the bed instead of her sleeping in the guest room. When I tried to hold her hand at dinner with my parents last Sunday, when I suggested we take a weekend trip to celebrate our first month of marriage. I respect that completely, I said. But we're married. I thought you thought wrong. She didn't even look up. I went to the kitchen and made myself a sandwich. Turkey and Swiss on wheat bread. Same thing I'd been eating for lunch at school since September. As I stood there chewing, I realized something had been bothering me for weeks. Back in March, during one of our premarital counseling sessions with Pastor Williams, Madison had made a comment that stuck with me. She'd said something about marriage being about security and partnership, not just physical stuff. At the time, I thought she meant we had a deep connection beyond just attraction. Now staring at the empty mayonnaise jar I'd forgotten to replace, I wondered if I'd missed something important. The woman in our living room felt like a stranger. The Madison I dated would curl up next to me during movies. She'd laugh at my terrible jokes about fractions and long division. She'd wake up early on Saturdays just to make coffee and sit with me while I graded papers. This Madison acted like I was a roommate. She barely tolerated. And something in her voice when she said, "You thought wrong," made me think this wasn't temporary. This was the plan all along. I met Madison at a teachers' conference in October 2 years ago. She was a social worker for the school district, handling the difficult family situations that teachers like me couldn't navigate alone. She was quiet, thoughtful, and had this way of listening that made you feel heard. When she smiled, which wasn't often, it felt earned. Our first date was coffee at a place downtown. We talked for 3 hours about everything except work. She told me about growing up in a small town in Illinois, how her parents had divorced when she was 12, and how she'd learned early that people weren't always what they seemed. I told her about my dad dying when I was in college, how teaching had saved me from a pretty dark period, and how I'd been ready to give up on finding someone who understood that my job wasn't just a paycheck. For the first year, everything felt right. She'd come to school events and talk easily with the other teachers. My mom loved her immediately, which was saying something since my mom had strong opinions about every woman I'd ever dated. Madison fit into my life in a way that felt natural. But looking back now, I could see the signs I'd ignored. She never wanted to talk about the future beyond vague statements about building something stable together. When we moved in together last summer, she insisted on keeping separate bank accounts and splitting everything exactly down the middle, even though I made more money and told her I didn't mind covering more expenses. During our engagement, she seemed more focused on the wedding details than on actually being married. She spent hours researching venues and flowers, but would change the subject whenever I brought up honeymoon plans or where we wanted to live long-term. When I suggested we could start trying for kids in a couple of years, she'd just nod and say, "We'll see." The biggest red flag came during our last counseling session in August. Pastor Williams asked us both what we were most looking forward to about marriage. I talked about building a family and growing old together. Madison said she was looking forward to having a stable foundation to build from. When he asked what she meant, she said something about how marriage would give her security to focus on her career goals. At the time, I thought she was just being practical. Madison had always been more reserved than me, more careful with her words. I figured she was nervous about making big emotional statements in front of a relative stranger. Now watching her scroll through her phone like I wasn't even in the room, I realized those weren't nerves. That was honesty. She'd married me for stability, not love. And the physical intimacy she'd shown me during our relationship, that was just the performance she needed to close the deal. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night in November. I'd made dinner. We'd eaten in silence. And she'd immediately gone to the guest room to read. I sat in the living room staring at the wall where we'd hung our wedding photos just 6 weeks earlier and tried to figure out what I was going to do. That's when I remembered something. During one of our counseling sessions, Pastor Williams had recorded our conversations for his notes. He'd asked permission and explained that he sometimes reviewed them to better help couples work through issues. Madison had agreed and we'd both sign forms allowing the recordings. I called Pastor Williams the next morning during my lunch break. "Derek, good to hear from you. How are you and Madison settling into married life? That's actually why I'm calling. I need to ask you something about those recordings from our sessions." There was a pause. "Is everything all right? I think Madison may have been dishonest about her intentions during our counseling. I need to know if those recordings still exist." Pastor Williams was quiet for a long moment. "Son, that's a serious accusation. What makes you think?" "She told me last night that she never intended to have a physical relationship with me after we got married. She said she married me for security, not because she loved me." "Oh, Derek." His voice dropped. "Yes, I still have the recordings. They're kept for 6 months after a couple completes counseling. If you're considering legal action, you should know that you both consented to the recording so they could potentially be used as evidence." That evening, I sat in my car in our driveway for 20 minutes before going inside. Madison was in the kitchen heating up leftover soup. "Madison, we need to talk." She didn't look up from the stove. "About what?" "About what you said during our premarital counseling about marriage being about security, not physical intimacy." She turned around then, and for the first time in weeks, I had her full attention. "What about it?" "Pastor Williams recorded those sessions. You said things in there that contradict everything you're telling me now." Her face went pale. "You wouldn't." "Wouldn't what?" "You wouldn't actually use those against me. That's private." I looked at this woman I'd thought I knew, this person I promised to love and honor, and realized I didn't recognize her at all. "Madison, did you ever intend to have a real marriage with me?" She set down her spoon and crossed her arms. "I gave you what I promised, a wife, a partnership. If you expected more than that, that's your problem." I nodded slowly. Okay. What? Okay. I understand now." I walked to our bedroom, pulled out my laptop, and started researching annulment procedures in Missouri. If Madison wanted a business arrangement, she was about to learn that business arrangements could be dissolved when one party committed fraud. I filed the petition for annulment on a Friday morning in December. The grounds were fraud and misrepresentation. Missouri law allows and one spouse conceals important facts that would have prevented the marriage from occurring. I hand-delivered the papers to Madison that evening when she got home from work. She read through them twice, then looked up at me with something I'd never seen before. Rage. "You're actually doing this over sex." "This isn't about sex, Madison. This is about honesty. You lied to me about what kind of marriage you wanted." She threw the papers on the kitchen counter. "I never lied about anything. I told you I valued stability and partnership. You told Pastor Williams that physical intimacy wasn't important to you in marriage. You said you were marrying me because I was safe and stable, not because you loved me. You said those exact words during our session in July." Her face went white. "Those sessions were supposed to be confidential. They were confidential until you decided to break our marriage vows 5 weeks after we made them." Madison spent the weekend on the phone with someone. I could hear her voice through the guest room door, but couldn't make out the words. On Monday morning, she was waiting for me in the kitchen with coffee and toast. The first time she'd made breakfast since our honeymoon. "Derek, I think we got off on the wrong foot. Marriage is an adjustment period. Maybe we can work through this." I looked at the woman who'd refused to touch me for over a month, who was now suddenly interested in reconciliation the moment legal papers got involved. What changed your mind? I realized I may have been too harsh. Physical intimacy is important in marriage. We can work on it. Work on it. How? She moved closer, putting her hand on my arm. However you want. I was just scared. You know, marriage is a big step. For a moment, I almost believed her. This was the Madison I dated, the one who'd convinced me she cared about more than just security. But then I remembered her words from Tuesday night. If you expected more than that, that's your problem, Madison. Why are you changing your tune now? I'm not changing anything. I'm trying to save our marriage. No, I said, gently removing her hand from my arm. You're trying to avoid the legal consequences of fraud. Her face hardened again. Fine. You want to do this the hard way. My lawyer says you'll never prove fraud. It's your word against mine and I'll testify that you're lying about those recordings. Your lawyer? I retained counsel over the weekend. He says this whole thing is just you being vindictive because you can't handle rejection. He says the court will see this as the man trying to punish his wife for exercising her bodily autonomy. I nodded slowly. Okay. Okay. What? Okay. I understand the strategy. You're going to paint me as controlling and abusive. Madison smiled for the first time in months, but it wasn't the smile I'd fallen in love with. The truth is the truth, Derek. You filed for annulment because I wouldn't sleep with you. How do you think that's going to look? That evening, I called my own attorney, Janet Morris, who'd handled my dad's estate 5 years earlier. I explained the situation and asked her to review the annulment petition. Derek, you need to understand something. Annulment cases are difficult to prove, especially when the other party contests them. Are you absolutely certain you have evidence to support your claims? I have recordings of her admitting she married me for financial security, not love. She explicitly stated that physical intimacy wasn't part of her expectations for marriage. And you have legal access to these recordings. Yes, we both consented to them being made. And Pastor Williams confirmed they can be used as evidence. Janet was quiet for a moment. In that case, you might have a stronger case than your wife's attorney realizes. The next morning, I drove to Pastor Williams' office to obtain copies of our counseling session recordings. He met me with a concerned expression in a manila envelope. Derek, I want you to know that I've prayed about this decision. I believe these recordings will help the truth come out, but I'm sorry it's come to this. What do you mean? He handed me the envelope. I reviewed the sessions after you called. There are things Madison said that I didn't fully understand at the time, but they make more sense now. That evening, I sat in my empty classroom and listened to 6 hours of recorded counseling sessions. What I heard changed everything I thought I knew about my wife. In the third session recorded in June, Pastor Williams asked Madison about her previous relationships. She explained that she dated several men over the years, but they'd all wanted too much emotional involvement. As she said, she preferred relationships where she could maintain her independence and focus on her career goals. When Pastor Williams asked what she was looking for in a husband, Madison's response was chilling. Someone stable who won't make emotional demands on me. Someone who will provide security without expecting me to be something I'm not. Pastor Williams asked if she understood that marriage typically involved emotional and physical intimacy. Madison replied, I think Derek will be satisfied with companionship and partnership. He's not the type to push for things I'm not comfortable with. In the fifth session, the conversation became even more revealing. Pastor Williams asked both of us what we expected from marriage in terms of intimacy and family planning. I talked about wanting kids and building a life together. Madison said she viewed marriage as a practical arrangement between two adults who respect each other's boundaries. When Pastor Williams pressed her about what those boundaries were, Madison said, I need someone who understands that I'm not a physically affectionate person. I can be a good wife in terms of partnership and household management, but I don't want to be pushed into romantic expectations that don't come naturally to me. The pastor asked if she'd discuss this with me. Madison said, Derek seems to understand that I'm more reserved than other women. I think he'll adapt, but the most damning recording came from our final session in August. Pastor Williams asked if we had any concerns about the upcoming marriage. I said I was excited about everything. Madison said she was relieved to finally have the security of marriage and that she was confident Derek would respect her need for space and independence. When the pastor asked what she meant by space, Madison explained that she intended to maintain separate sleeping arrangements after marriage and that she hoped I would understand that physical intimacy isn't a priority for her. Pastor Williams asked if she'd discuss this with me. Madison said, "Not directly, but I've given him signals. If he hasn't picked up on them, we'll address it after the wedding." I turned off the recording and sat in a dark classroom for an hour. Madison hadn't just lied to me about her intentions. She'd planned the entire deception from the beginning. She'd counted on me being too nice, too accommodating, too desperate for companionship to demand honesty about what our marriage would actually involve. The woman I'd married had never intended to be a wife in any meaningful sense. She'd wanted a roommate who would split the bills and provide social respectability while asking for nothing in return. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd been honest about her plans to Pastor Williams, probably because she thought those conversations would never see the light of day. I spent the weekend organizing evidence and preparing for the legal battle ahead. On Monday morning, I called Janet Morris and scheduled a meeting to review the recordings. Janet listened to selected portions of the counseling sessions, taking notes and occasionally shaking her head. When we finished, she leaned back in her chair and looked at me with something close to amazement. "Derek, in 20 years of family law, I've never seen such clear evidence of premarital fraud. Your wife essentially admitted to multiple instances of intentional deception. What does that mean for the annulment case?" "It means we're not just going to win. We're going to win decisively. Missouri courts take marriage fraud very seriously, especially when there's documented evidence of deliberate deception." Janet explained the next steps. We would file a motion to include the recordings as evidence along with a detailed timeline of Madison's deceptive behavior. We would also request that Madison cover all legal costs and return any gifts or benefits she'd received as a result of the fraudulent marriage. "There's one more thing," Janet said. "If Madison's attorney tries to argue that this is about sexual coercion or abuse, these recordings will completely destroy that narrative. She clearly states multiple times that she never intended to have a physical relationship with you and that she married you specifically because she thought you wouldn't demand one." That evening, Madison was waiting for me when I got home from work. She'd cooked dinner and set the table with our wedding china, something she'd never done since we'd been married. "Derek, I've been thinking about what you said. Maybe we can go to counseling together and work through this." I sat down across from her and looked at the elaborate meal she'd prepared. Pot roast with vegetables, homemade bread, and apple pie for dessert. "Madison, when did you cook all this?" "I took the afternoon off work. I wanted to show you that I'm serious about fixing our marriage by cooking dinner, by making an effort, by showing you that I care about this relationship." I took a bite of the pot roast. It was excellent. Probably the best meal she'd ever made. "This is really good." She smiled and for a moment looked genuinely happy. "I'm glad you like it. I thought maybe we could start over. Put all this legal stuff behind us and focus on building something real." "Madison, why now? Why didn't you want to build something real 2 months ago?" Her smile faltered slightly. "I told you I was scared. Marriage is a big adjustment." "No," I said quietly. "You weren't scared. You got exactly what you wanted. A husband who would pay half the bills and leave you alone." "That's not true." I pulled out my phone and played a 30-second clip from one of our counseling sessions. Madison's voice filled the dining room. "I need someone who understands that I'm not a physically affectionate person. I can be a good wife in terms of partnership and household management, but I don't want to be pushed into romantic expectations that don't come naturally to me." Madison's face went white. She stood up so quickly her chair fell over. "You can't use those. Those were private conversations. Those were conversations where you admitted to planning exactly what you've done to our marriage. Derek, please. We can work this out. I'll do whatever you want." I looked at this woman who'd spent 2 months refusing to touch me, who was now offering to do whatever I wanted because she'd been caught in her own lies. "Madison, what I want is an honest marriage, and you've already proven that's something you can't provide." The court hearing took place on a cold morning in January. Madison arrived with her attorney, a well-dressed man who looked confident despite the evidence stacked against his client. Janet had warned me that Madison's lawyer would likely try to argue that I was emotionally abusive or sexually coercive, painting me as a controlling husband who couldn't accept his wife's boundaries. Judge Patricia Henderson called the case to order and asked both sides to present their arguments. Madison's attorney went first, laying out exactly the defense Janet had predicted. "Your Honor, this case represents a dangerous precedent. Mr. Langston is attempting to punish his wife for exercising her fundamental right to bodily autonomy. The annulment petition is nothing more than retaliation for her refusal to submit to his sexual demands." The attorney painted Madison as a victim of spousal pressure, claiming that she'd been intimidated into changing her mind about physical intimacy after marriage. He argued that no wife should face legal consequences for saying no to her husband. Then Janet stood up. "Your Honor, I'd like to present audio evidence that directly contradicts the defense's characterization of this case." She played selected excerpts from our counseling sessions, including Madison's statements about marrying me for security, her admission that she never intended to have physical intimacy in our marriage, and her acknowledgement that she was giving me signals about her intentions without being direct about them. The courtroom was silent as Madison's voice filled the space, calmly explaining her plan to deceive me about the fundamental nature of our marriage. Judge Henderson asked to hear the recordings again, then looked directly at Madison. "Mrs. Langston, these recordings suggest that you entered into marriage with no intention of fulfilling basic marital obligations and that you deliberately concealed this from your husband. Do you dispute the authenticity of these recordings?" Madison's attorney whispered something to her, but she shook her head. "No, Your Honor, but I was just being honest about my feelings. Honest with Pastor Williams, but not with your husband." Madison had no answer. Judge Henderson granted the annulment without hesitation. She ruled that Madison had committed fraud by concealing her true intentions about the marriage and that her deception constituted grounds for voiding the marriage contract entirely. Furthermore, the judge continued, "I'm ordering Mrs. Langston to return all gifts received in connection with this marriage and to pay all court costs and attorney fees. Marriage is a legal contract based on mutual understanding and good faith. When one party deliberately deceives the other about fundamental aspects of that contract, they bear responsibility for the consequences." Madison's face crumpled as the reality hit her. Not only was our marriage annulled, but she would have to return thousands of dollars in wedding gifts and pay over $10,000 in legal fees. As we left the courthouse, Madison tried one last time to speak to me. "Derek, I'm sorry. I never meant for it to go this far." I looked at her for what I knew would be the last time. "Madison, you meant for it to go exactly this far. You just didn't expect to get caught." Within a month, word had spread through our social circles about what had happened. The teachers at school, who had all admired Madison's apparent devotion during our engagement, now understood why she'd seemed so detached at school events. My friends, who had thought Madison was just shy, realized they'd witnessed calculated emotional manipulation. Madison's reputation at the school district suffered significantly. Parents began requesting that their children's cases be handled by other social workers. Her supervisor quietly suggested she might be happier in a different department, one with less direct family interaction. 6 months later, I heard that Madison had moved back to Illinois. She'd left Kansas City entirely, unable to rebuild her professional credibility after the truth came out about her capacity for deception in personal relationships. For me, the experience taught me something valuable about the difference between being understanding and being naive. I'd confused Madison's emotional unavailability with depth, her calculation with thoughtfulness. When I eventually started dating again, I knew to look for someone who could be honest about what they wanted from a relationship. Madison had wanted security without commitment, partnership without intimacy, marriage without love. What she got instead was a public demonstration that fraud has consequences even in matters of the heart. Sometimes the most important lesson isn't about love, it's about truth.